What a powerful set of voices this morning, starting with Kevin at the Y, and now so many of these young adults doing such great work. My name's Rick Cruz. I'm with the America's Promise Alliance team. I'm joined today by Leah Jewell from Pearson, who runs their career development employability work. Just a few reflections before we start talking. This morning, in so many ways, represents the landscape of organizations who are going to carry this work forward across the next decade. Organizations with tremendous, lengthy history, like the Y, like Pearson, and a number of really high-impact upstarts, innovative programs that are addressing challenges that we're seeing in communities now. And in so many ways, this is the work, as America's Promise does what you do when you approach your 20th anniversary, reflect on what has happened and figure out what's ahead for the field. So for those of you who will be joining us the rest of the morning, we'll continue that conversation in a particular breakout as to what is ahead, what should that agenda be. So I'd encourage you to join that conversation. But today we're going to talk right now about one of the most important components, which is how do we get young people ready for the real world? And we got the real story right here, Leah. So as I said, Leah is with Pearson. She leads their efforts to prepare young people for careers, oftentimes young people who are transitioning into their first career or who are advancing in their careers. And she spends a lot of time talking with institutions, programs, and young people themselves about what they need to do that. So Leah, let me start by just asking your reflections from that conversation today.
Well, I guess my first reflection is, wow, that was amazing, right? It's great to hear these kinds of stories. And I think the first thing that popped out to me is you can't overestimate the power of the relationships. And there was a lot of conversation about that. And I think it's one of the things I'm very jealous about is that, I wish that we had the ability to scale that, even more than we do today. The other thing that was very interesting to me about what everyone was talking about was this idea of sort of the transition to a career and how important those skills are. We've done a lot of research and looked at a lot of the research at Pearson, and we know there are really sort of 4 buckets that make somebody an employable person, right? You've got to have basic skills, reading, writing, even basic IT skills. You've got to have some kind of occupational skill, personal and social capabilities, which we hear a lot about with soft skills. And then this 4th bucket, which is really career transition skills. And it's that 4th bucket that oftentimes gets ignored or gets, set to the side or dealt with at the very, very end. And it was so interesting to hear, Netsu in particular talk about how important that was, and how little, people, I think, know what those steps are and how to actually go about taking the knowledge and information that they have and then actually transition into the workplace.
A really interesting point, because we're talking about a whole system or systems of different pieces that need to come together for a young person. So, as you think about the work that you do, how do we take a young person through those different steps, knowing that they come into contact with an education system, with programs like these, and then work?
Yeah, I think that's a great question because it seems pretty obvious, right? It seems obvious that you need to have, you need to sort of have some skills to help you take what you know and get into the workplace. And yet, what we've really found out is that people really don't understand what's involved. What are those steps? And so we've done quite a bit of work to sort of break those steps down for people, and we've sort of come up with 9 milestones. I won't go into them here, but it's really about how do you start to break down that process for a student, for somebody who's trying to, transition. And we find that that's where they're able to sort of digest it. They can start to break down what the pieces are, because this idea of transitioning to a career is this really big idea. They, like, what do I do? I mean, Netsu's like, I didn't even have a clue that LinkedIn was that big of a deal. And yet, even when you tell them it's a big deal for certain types of jobs, they don't know what to do with it. So how do we start to break those pieces down? And then more importantly, how do we actually get people to think about this at the beginning of their journey and not at the end of their journey, because that's a lot of times what happens is they start the journey, then they get to the end, and then they go, oh, okay, now I have to figure out what do I want to do? How am I going to do this? I mean, I'll give you an example. Even people that that are in college, less than 25% of those people take advantage of the career services that are available to them. That's crazy. And when they do it at the very end, when oftentimes it's too late for them to actually build those skills and or even take advantage and sort of redirect if they needed to redirect, because now they have no time to actually do it.
That last data point actually has me thinking about this larger question of what are we preparing young people for? So if we're not accessing career services, where are we? We spend a lot of time at America's Promise, and so many of us here talking about high school graduation. Well, it's a starting point. What are we setting our sights on for young people? And career is one of those things that comes to mind. How do you see organizations that you work with helping reframe that conversation in such a way that young people in particular, are thinking about that end point?
Yeah. Well, I mean, that is the number one reason why people pursue any type of further education. They say to get a job, to put themselves in a better job, to get a better job, to have a career. So we know that's actually the reason why. And when you talk about how expensive it is for lots of people to get that further education, it's even more important that they're, I think, very knowledgeable and specific about getting the information up front to make smart choices. I mean, I'm agnostic about what people do, but if you've got some data in front of you that explains to you what are the jobs, where are they, what are the skills that are required, how do those match up with your interests and aptitudes, and you have that early on, I think you might make some different choices along the way. And I think that one of the really key things that's happening today is, and it's so obvious from so many of the organizations that are here, is this effort to try to bring the ecosystem more closer together and have these conversations that I think we haven't really had consistently in the past. And it's everything from, academic institutions to employers to the nonprofits. How do you start to engage all of those people in the conversation? Because it's not, we're not going to be effective at skilling people up. We're not going to be effective at closing the skills gap, getting people the jobs that are the highest demand jobs that are out there, unless those conversations are taking place.
Yeah. The way we talk about it is how do we stop the blame game of this part of the system isn't preparing young people, or this part of the system is not prepared to work with our young people, but instead have the conversation about how we come together. And this is a group that has come together in many instances around other goals. And now as we set our sights on, well, what does adult success look like for our young people? We want them to have credentials that power them to good lives, full lives. When you look out across the landscape of communities, organizations, states that you work with, a couple of examples that really sing for you, that sort of maybe may point to how we need to be thinking about this differently.
Yeah, let's see. I can think of a couple that fall into a couple of different buckets. One is this idea of early career transition information and knowledge, and we're partnering with the University of North Texas, which I think is the 24th largest public institution in the United States. I'm sure not everybody knew that, but it's quite large. And their goal is actually to expose everybody early, right at the beginning, right when you enroll, to help them understand what are those skills, what are the qualifications, what is it that you need to be developing over the course of your learner journey so that you're prepared when you get to the end. And I think that's a pretty powerful statement from an institution, basically saying we're going to pay for everybody to try to get this information early on. Another example, because you mentioned certifications and credentials, which I think are really critical, and they really speak to this idea of lifelong learning and the fact that you can start here, get a job, and then continue along the pathway, get another credential, get another job. We do a lot of work with industry association partnerships, and industry association partnerships are very important to us at Pearson because they're the easiest aggregator of employers in our view. And so we work with people like the National Restaurant Association, the National Center for Construction Education and Research, and these are people that represent employers. What are the skills and the qualifications that you need to be able to get a job? And then we help deliver that learning and those certifications and that kind of assessment to to anybody who's really interested. And some of those industry partnerships require employers to actually be at the table in that conversation with a nonprofit, with an academic institution. And I think it's the power of those groups to be able to do that that's really going to change how people are learning and how they prepare themselves to get a job.
I think it's a powerful perspective as you think about the different parties that come to that table, which is that for all that we talk about sometimes this very linear path to success, I think the young people, young adults today, and in our experience, I'm sure you're seeing it, it's anything but linear, and especially when we're looking at our communities of color, the experience of Latino and African American youth who are thinking about credentials and jobs and taking care of family responsibilities on a pathway to maybe it's an A, B, BA, and then beyond. And the systems haven't always been incredibly nimble.
Yeah.
So as you mentioned the 9-part sort of process. Maybe you can take an opportunity to say a little bit more about that and how that helps equip different parts of the system, perhaps, to have those conversations or push those conversations forward as a young person thinks about where they ultimately want to be.
Yeah. Well, I mean, at the beginning, I think you're just really trying to help people understand what their interests and their aptitudes are, right? And then how do you sort of match those to skills? How do you match the skills to jobs? The jobs to pathways, right? I mean, it's all relatively logical. It's just that people don't break it down for students or for the learners. And then as you progress, you start to do things, and I think this is pretty applicable for almost any kind of job that you would want to do. It's not targeted at certain jobs and not other jobs, but you actually have to know, kind of almost like what's your brand? What do you believe about yourself? What do you want to communicate to an employer? You need to be able to interview. You need to be able to do the public speaking, things, you've got to actually along the way understand that these personal and social capabilities are really important, and that actually you're developing them not in one program, not in one class, but that you're developing them over the course of a very long period of time, really over the course of your life, and that there are lots of ways that you can do that. And I think being able to say to somebody, these are sort of the personal and social capabilities that are important. They're important for you to get any kind of a job. Here's how you can start to develop those skills. Here's how you can start to show that you have those skills to an employer. I mean, that in and of itself, I think, is pretty powerful.
What it sounds like is setting up, and you use the word learning, which is really important. We're not talking about just education systems or just employers or just programming. We're talking about how do we support the learning experience of a person through some of these maybe sometimes difficult transitions early on, but across their entire life, entire career. Yep. And I think about it from the perspective of creating the opportunity for people to take advantage of the choices, creating the choices and arming them to have the choices. And I think it's important that we reframe. I think one of the things we need to take on and lock arms around is how do we reframe this conversation so that we're not engaged in the old discussions and the old battles, but how do we actually support this vision of young people?
Yeah, and I think you said it so well a few minutes ago, which is I think we've been very linear in our thinking about how you get from point A to point B. And in fact, there are, and the conversations in this room and the conversations I think that are happening in the last couple of years actually show the power in multiple pathways, the power that, there isn't just one way to proceed. You don't just have to go get a bachelor's degree. There are so many different ways that you can go. And I think educating people to that concept, and giving people an understanding that you will never stop learning along the way, and that even after you get that first job, you're going to need to, probably reskill or skill up, and that learning is just going to happen throughout their life. It doesn't stop just because you got that first job.
Yeah. Yeah, and there seems to have been a real, and I think this is a positive thing, a proliferation of programs and approaches and different models, maybe almost too much so, or really fractured. For all of our guests today who are going to be going back to their communities and leading pieces of this conversation, but also, and I think I could speak for all of them, very attuned to needing to partner. Any advice as you think about it from the perspective of a corporation?
Besides the fact that we would love to partner with everybody here, besides that, actually, that's the best part about what's happened the last couple of days. Is I think that nobody really can do it by themselves, and everybody, if anything, I think this is the beauty of what's happening here for the last couple of days and in all of these organizations, is actually seeing the need to bring different people to the table, to look at what your strengths are and where are the gaps, and then find the people that can help you fill those gaps. And I know we feel that way at Pearson. We can't do everything. I'm sure that everybody in this room feels the same way. And I just think that if we've got a problem to solve, the more we look around the room and outside of the room at the people who can help us solve that problem, and then go and find them and let's make that happen, the faster we'll get there.
That's great. That's great. One last sort of question or exercise for us here is, as you think about the work moving forward, certainly partnership. We've talked about relationships today, and we've talked about career exposure. I'll offer up my thought here in terms of work that we need to do moving forward to really push this conversation. And one area I think maybe is a gap, which is as we think about a new definition of readiness, how do we assess that? Like, what are the next generation assessments? An area I know your organization knows a lot about. Love any thoughts there, or if there's another area where you're like, we need to answer that question, and maybe this is the group that can help us moving forward, so that we can arm everyone to push this conversation forward.
Well, that's a day-long conversation. Right? But just a couple thoughts on that, and actually in reference to what they're doing at the University of North Texas. So one of the things the University of North Texas is saying is, actually, we need to extend the transcript. They want to take the transcript and have it mean more than what it does today. And part of what they mean by that is, the degree has always been the de facto, endorsement of skills, and yet, I think what we're learning today is that that's not necessarily the case, right? And that you can graduate and still not necessarily have the skills that you need to do a job. So one of the things that they're doing is they're looking at building out portfolios for the students right from the very beginning, and that gives a way to actually really have some solid artifacts that they'll integrate into not only the transcript work that they have at the school, but that they can also where somebody actually has something physical that they can then take to an employer, whether it's a speech, whether it's a project, whether it's something that actually shows not that they got an A, B, or C or passed this class, but that this is actually the work that they did. And I think that concept, it's a different kind of assessment, right, but it's a real powerful assessment in the sense that it really shows an employer the work that you've actually done.
Yeah. And how do you see that gaining traction? Yes.
Well, yeah, I think it's certainly not the only answer, right, for how you would extend out the transcript. I mean, but I think that the more that people know what those options are, the more that you can see examples of people who are taking advantage of it and doing something with it, I think the more that'll start to scale. The other thing I think that we're seeing is a lot more work in terms of badging, because the other thing that badging does is it actually really gives you a lot more visibility into the detail behind the work that you actually did. Again, instead of just here's a grade, here's something, you can actually, an employer can actually click on a badge and they can literally see what were all of the learning outcomes, what did you have to do. And I think there's so much activity in that space right now. I think we're going to see a lot more of that as it speaks to sort of stacked credentials and lifelong learning.
I think about my first job, which embarrassingly or not, was in this comic book store in the Bronx when I was 14. I don't use all of those skills every day, but the customer service, well, sometimes I feel like I do. The customer service orientation, those sorts of things that are so critical. And I think about it for my kids.
Yeah.
You know, what's that experience that's going to teach them the independence of having to look somebody who you gave the wrong change to?
Yeah.
And that's a very sort of sort of parochial example, but we're talking here about some of the skills the young people talked about earlier today.
Yeah, well, and I bet you do use a lot more of those comic book skills than you would imagine, because I think that so much of those personal and social capabilities that people actually develop actually come from that first job experience, any job experience, right? I mean, boy, that would be my wish, is that everybody, you know, has to go through some kind of job experience before they actually get out there, right?
Yeah.
And that's because I think that's really where you start to build those skills. You've got to interact with people, you've got to work on a team, you've got to be responsible and show up on time, I hope, or else you get fired. You know, I mean, all of those things. And you get those at those entry level, those very first jobs. And, you know, I don't know what the statistics are, but it would be really interesting to see how many people actually do that as they're sort of going through their pathway, because I think it's really critical.
Yeah. As we've been talking more and more to many of our partners and like-minded organizations nationally, one in particular is very adamant that we should have a view on 100% work-based internships before someone graduates from high school. There's always get anxious when you strive for 100% of anything, but I think there is sort of real value in that experience for all young people, but I think in particular for young people who need exposure to very different pathways, and it may not be getting it in other ways.
Yeah, absolutely. I think 100% is a great goal. I think that would be fantastic. I think that's just where, I mean, you just cannot replace the type of learning that you get in an internship, on the job, in any kind of job. Really, really good stuff.
Great. 1 minute to go. Last word. What would you like us to walk away from your experience with as we tackle this issue of pathways and employability moving forward?
Well, I mean, first off, I want you to know I'm going to walk away probably with way more than what you guys are going to walk away with from this conversation, because I think that just what I've seen and I've heard here is really, really spectacular. It's spectacular work. You know, what we're trying to do at Pearson is really trying to take little pieces of that and scale it as much as we possibly can. And we know that, you know, you're not going to have the total ecosystem, and, you know, and we can't sort of bring it all together. But this idea of being able to try to get to people as early as possible, to let them know that, you know, here's the stuff that you have to do to prepare for a career. I don't think you can do that early enough and then help them along the way. I think that's a big takeaway for me.
Great. Well, I want to thank everybody for joining us for this session. Leah, thank you. Thank Pearson for all the work you're doing here. It's a conversation we will continue to push at America's Promise as we think about the work of the next decade and even shorter term. And I know we've got a number of great conversations set up for the rest of the morning. Thank you. Thank all of you.